Good morning. I'm Lori Matson, President and CEO of the Tri-City Regional Chamber. Thank you so much for attending the third annual Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. Much thought and planning have gone into this three-day summit, which features 5 listening sessions intended to create open, meaningful dialogue about issues that affect business and residents in our region. Today's first session will focus on child well-being and education equity. The next session, which begins at 11:15, focuses on economic inequity and opportunity. Before we begin, allow me to thank Battelle, the premier sponsor of the Diversity Summit. We greatly appreciate their partnership during the past 3 years as premier sponsor of this impactful event. Next, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Woods, President of Columbia Basin College, one of our silver sponsors, to say a few words.
Hello, Columbia Basin College is really proud to serve as a silver sponsor for the 2020 Tri-Cities Diversity Summit. It is so exciting to be able to see the Regional Chamber continue to emphasize how important diversity is in our local workforce, in our educational institutions, and to see our whole community come together to celebrate all the diverse cultures that we have here in the Mid-Columbia Basin. Currently, CBC, we are one of the most diverse higher educational institutions in the state. We're considered a Hispanic serving institution, one of 6 within the state of Washington. We have over 43% of our enrollment is Hispanic, and more than 40% of our students identify as first-generation college students. So thank you to our whole community and to the Chamber for continuing to create a venue for conversation, for connection, and the chance for all of us to really grapple with meaningful solutions for our community that will help benefit all of us, including all of the students at Columbia Basin College. We really are very proud to be part of this summit. So thank you again for doing this.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks so much for your support. Let's welcome our session moderator, Kate McAteer, and her panelists who will discuss how children and youth can thrive in their daily lives and have fair opportunity for educational achievement. Kate is the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at WSU Tri-Cities. Kate is also the Chief Academic Officer for the campus and the Principal Investigator of the TRIO program, which serves to assist low-income individuals, first-generation college students, and individuals with disabilities. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you for the opportunity to moderate this panel today. Good morning, everyone. We have brought together a group of phenomenal leaders to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and issues in education. They represent the K12 system here in the Mid-Columbia region, higher education at the state and the national level, and corporation and educational partnerships at the national and international level. So I'd like to introduce them. First, we have Superintendent Michelle Whitney. Michelle has been part of the Pasco School District for more than 20 years. Since 2016, she has served as the superintendent, overseeing a school district with more than 2,000 employees and over 18,000 students. Welcome, Michelle. Dr. Kenneth Chris Hurst, Sr., Superintendent of the Othello School District since 2016. Prior to that, Chris served in San Diego County, California, where his career ranged from being a U.S. Marine Corps drill instructor, a mathematics teacher, an assistant principal, a principal, and associate superintendent. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Daria Willis. Dr. Willis was appointed the 17th president of Everett Community College in 2019, becoming its first African-American president, a highlight in an impressive career in higher education. Prior to her appointment, Dr. Willis served as provost and senior vice president of academic affairs at Onondaga Community College in Syracuse, New York, within the State University of the New York system. Her leadership has brought substantial educative change to community colleges, students, faculty, and staff. Welcome. And with us all the way from New York City is Charlotte Lysohir. Charlotte currently leads the global strategy for PTech, IBM's marquee corporate social responsibility program that aims to create an alternative pathway for young people in low-income communities to find meaningful employment in STEM careers. Thank you all for joining us today. So yesterday, the summit kicked off with a panel on racial justice and reconciliation, which opened with a discussion on the need to differentiate equity from equality in conversations around diversity and inclusion. So many of you have heard education has often been quoted as the great equalizer, but we know that the equity gaps that exist in education are currently being compounded by the current pandemic. So these equity gaps in educational attainment are the product of many disparities in student outcomes by gender, by race, and income along the entire educational pipeline, which all of you represent today. So with that in mind, I'd like to start with a general question for each of you. So what are the biggest barriers to racial justice in education today? So Dr. Willis, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, Kate. I got kind of mixed up on my mute button there, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to be talking with a group of distinguished panelists. But to answer your question, I think that there's a lot that we can unpack here. But first and foremost, systemic racism is a problem that we see in education in general, in higher ed, K12. Doesn't really matter, which way you cut the pie. When I think about the things that we still need to do and that we can do better, issues such as our hiring practices. We talk about how diverse our institutions are, but when we look at the employees at our colleges and at our K12 schools, the majority of them are white. Very few of some of those employees look like their student populations. And it's important for students to see themselves reflected in the classroom. It's important for students to see themselves reflected in the staff members that are there to assist those students. We also have, issues with culturally responsive pedagogy and the overall absence of that. And these traditional values and norms and these Eurocentric ideas that are given to our students that don't make them feel like they are valued members and parts of the curriculum. And then there's also this, I was talking about this with my son and my husband this morning. He's in the 3rd grade. But this idea of individualism in education and how we test our students. And sometimes we have this idea that they're all cheating because they worked with someone on an exam. But, again, that's not part of culturally responsive pedagogy. I don't know what career students, when they leave college or when they leave high school, that they go into and they're working primarily on their own. But yet in the education system, we force them to do these things by themselves, in my opinion, which is yet another westernized viewpoint. So, we have to really unpack some of those traditional values that were really highlighted in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that just aren't valued at this point for our students as the demographics continue to change in colleges, universities, and our K-12 systems across the country. We need to diversify our faculty and staff. We need to give culturally responsive pedagogy to our students, and we need to train our faculty members, especially on what it means to serve students of color and underserved populations across this country.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hurst, would you like to add to Dr. Willis's comments?
Absolutely, and I wholeheartedly agree. And I would just add that I think another big barrier for racial injustice in education is certainly implicit bias. And what I mean by that is certainly educators across the nation, across the globe, really they bring their own stereotypes, their own experiences and attitudes to the table, and that affects their actions, it affects their decisions, and it's done unconsciously. It happens every day. It happens when we look at discipline referrals. It happens when we look at what's happening in the classroom with regards to academics. And I'll just share with you, there was a recent research that has come out from Stanford, and it really highlighted this practice of unconscious bias or implicit bias. And it looked at a diverse group of female K-12 teachers And what it did is it gave these teachers infractions of students who had fictitious names from stereotypical Black names such as Deshaun or Darnell, and fictitious made up white names such as Jake and Greg. And as these teachers looked at these two infractions, which were really minor infractions, what was revealed through the research is that the teachers were more likely to escalate the disciplinary response to those who were perceived to be Black as opposed to those who were perceived to be white, which is really telling about what we're facing in education. As you look across our nation, when you look at attendance, discipline, grades, credits, graduation rates across the country, you're really focusing on our Latino and African American population. So all of those actions can really be traced to unconscious bias. And again, it really can be harmful and detrimental to our students because our educators are doing this on a repeated basis and they're doing it unconsciously, so implicit bias. But there are ways that we can really address this, but I would say that's one of the biggest factors that really is facing racial injustice in education is implicit biases, or what we're bringing to the table unconsciously.
Yeah, and I think that's critical too, as Dr. Willis said, in the hiring practices, the implicit bias that exists in hiring practices currently in education. So it's throughout the whole, from the hiring practices to instruction in the classrooms to, co-curricular, extracurricular, everywhere. So yes. Superintendent Whitney.
Well, thank you. I absolutely agree with all of the great words of wisdom that were shared before me. And I think what I wanted to highlight is actually something I learned at this very summit last year. I heard it said, talent and aptitudes are distributed across the community equally, but opportunities are not. And I think those of us who sit in roles like those on the panel and community leaders across our communities really need to own our responsibility in bridging that gap and recognizing that it requires a fundamental willingness to sit across the table or shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee with people who don't look like you, who don't believe like you, and ask, how can I help? And from a place of genuine and authentic desire to know and understand someone else's experience and being a willing partner to dismantle the barriers that are getting in the way from people actualizing their hopes and dreams. The world hangs labels around our necks based on the way we look, the way we believe, the way we were raised. And it is absolutely fundamentally the responsibility of those who sit in chairs like mine to dismantle, to remove those labels and open doors for and shuttle as many people through them as we possibly can. And so I think it's really this, either it's fear or not knowing how, not knowing where to get started, that until we really break that apart and recognize that at the core of dismantling barriers is relationship based in empathy and understanding, but that's not enough. It has to also then be paired with brave action in moving forward to dismantle these systems that have dated those of us that are in leadership now for hundreds of years. And, I'm proud to be on this panel today and proud to serve with leaders in this community who I know are digging into that work and making fundamental changes. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So Charlotte, in your role in corporate relations with education, I'm sure you're seeing there's lots of barriers, but could you talk about one in particular?
Yeah, I think everything that was said was, just so spot on, and it's almost hard to add to because I think that so much was covered in those answers. I would just say, I think from my perspective, it's almost like, how does that implicit bias or systemic racism impact structures and systems? And so obviously there, are people's own biases that need to be reconciled, but at the same time, there's a lot of policy that needs to be reconciled within these existing systems, just even down to funding and how public education is still funded from local property taxes and we know that that creates a wealth gap, and that wealth gap creates, basically segregation within our school systems. So there's a lot of kind of policy level, I think, work that needs to be done would be maybe the only thing I would add. And I think on the industry side, on the hiring side, a lot of the same work that was mentioned that kind of teachers and faculty members need to do, I would argue that not only hiring and sort of talent acquisition professionals, but also managers, need to do a lot of that same work and make sure that their own biases aren't impacting who's getting promoted, who's getting hired, who's getting opportunities. I think that it's, it is systemic, and it totally, sort of bleeds into the workforce from education.
Yes, thank you. So I'd just like to talk to Superintendent Whitney and Superintendent Hurst about the K12 schools and their current plans to really ensure that the pandemic does not derail the aspirations and the achievements of this generation of students. I think it's especially true for students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, students with disabilities, English learners. All of these groups were already at less supported, let's say, than others towards graduation. So in normal circumstances, the supports aren't there for them as much. So could you give some examples of how your district is addressing the issue today? So we'll start with you, Michelle.
So I really want to highlight our staff and that relational orientation that it takes to bridge the gap in this environment for some of our most vulnerable families. So right away, when the governor closed our schools in March, fundamentally in my head, I understood that it was for our community safety and in a pandemic. But in my heart, I knew that there were kids who were depending on us for that safe, stable environment. And having been a child that depended on the public school system for that safe, predictable place of stability and support, I knew it from a very real place. So right away, we identified a system where we had 1,500 students personally identified and individually case managed in small groups and attached to an adult who were checking in on them regularly. And we did that work in partnership with community and schools. But we also are just really blessed in our community of Pasco that our community has supported levies for decades and decades that have allowed us to enrich our staffing model in Pasco with graduation intervention specialists, behavior intervention specialists. We have counselors in every school, social workers. We have a robust network of support beyond academic teachers who partnered with us in that individual case management. So we were able to do things like ensure kids had computers, internet access to food, medical services, counseling services, but most of all, to break that barrier of just the social isolation that the initial quarantine caused for our families who really do depend on us. We served meals, hundreds of thousands of meals over the summer to students who needed them, to all students, and in particular students that needed them the most. We also had a hotline where families could call in, get resources. It was a multilingual hotline so that we knew that students or families who needed translation English, Russian, and Spanish could have access to that. But the beautiful thing about it, beyond just the information they could get access to, was they could leave a message and a person would call them back. So not only did we create a mechanism for identifying the vulnerable families we were aware of, we created a mechanism where families could self-identify that maybe we didn't know that they were in a situation of vulnerability, so we were able to intervene that way. Those structures we've just used as a foundation to move into the fall and gotten even more personalized in the delivery of that relation-oriented service. So for example, when we started school in those first 3 days, we had 1,200 students that we knew were registered, had picked up laptops, but were not yet connected to instruction. Within just a handful of days, we were able to track every single one of those kids down less 100 kids. So we went from 1,200 kids, not knowing where 1,200 kids were, to 100 kids. And that was fundamentally based on staff intervention. from phone calling to going to people's homes multiple times. We had principals that would start their day every day with their car full of laptops, driving around Pasco looking for families. The amount of outreach and the intensity of that individualized attention was absolutely incredible. I was floored by it. I should not have been surprised. When we say we are Pasco, for us, it means we are fundamentally committed to bridging the gap for those students who need us the most. And so I shouldn't have been surprised, but I absolutely was floored by the amount of effort that went into it and how we were able to mobilize and so quickly intervene on behalf of our students. So I think the interventions that we're really relying on are that relational orientation, but all of that is on a foundation of belief that was set decades and decades ago. We believe in We Are Pasco and our responsibility to bridge that gap. We believe in 100%. We walk that walk every day. So we have a foundation that we stand on. And in this pandemic of uncertainty, it has been a comfort in knowing that we are strong in those tightly held core values.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Chris?
Well, I'd just like to echo what Superintendent Whitney said, and I wholeheartedly agree. And I would just like to add another perspective as well that we're doing in the conversations that we are having and really beginning at the beginning stages. I think we have recognized, one, through this epidemic or pandemic, the number of days, hours of instruction that our students have missed. And really, when you look at the term chronic absenteeism, our students, all of them really fit that category. They've been absent 18 days or more. So one of the things that we have realized is that our students are coming to us with significant gaps. So it's going to be really important right now, and this is a conversation that we're having, that we have the right data in front of our teachers. So I really love, one, what Michelle was saying about meeting the students where they are and that relationship component, but then this whole other side where we have to look at their academic success and their goals and their dreams and desires and making sure that we're progressing towards that end. And this is what I really mean. So typically, when a fifth grader comes in to the school and when they return, you can look at them where their reading level is, and you can determine, okay, is this student at a third grade reading level or fourth grade reading level? But what the conversation we're having right now is we need to dig a little bit deeper than that, and really a lot deeper. And the teachers are going to have the right data in front of them so they can identify the domain and the skill level that those students are at, so they can really address those gaps. I think the other conversation that we're having is balancing prerequisite skills versus grade level learning that needs to happen. So when you think about the number of hours and days that our students have missed, they're missing, mostly all of our students are missing critical prerequisite skills that they need to be successful throughout the year. So we understand that difference between grade level learning, the regular content, but then the prerequisite skills that's going to allow you to be successful. And there's just not enough time right now throughout the school year to try to do both. So engage the students with prerequisite skills and then going to do the grade level learning that needs to happen. So the conversation that we're having is, how do we give our teachers the strategies, our educators the strategies to meld those two? So focusing on the most critical prerequisite skills for our students so they can then engage with the grade level work that needs to happen. I think the other conversation that we're having is goal setting. So for us, we're really pushing that we want every learner to have growth goals that's going to put them on a path to success. That's the ideal. So every student having that growth goal, but we're also asking that our teachers, our educators, that those growth goals are very ambitious for our students, but they're also attainable. But we do understand that because our students are coming to the table, those who are resilient and they understand how to persevere and they have coping strategies, Those students are going to persevere, they're going to make it, but then you have those students who are not as resilient, who are going to have difficulties. So their growth goals may extend past 1 year. It may take more than a year to get those students caught up. So again, ambitious growth goals, but not so ambitious that they cannot attain them. And I think what we're talking about right now also is the importance of high quality instruction. And we know that's extremely important every day, but it's even more important right now that our administrators are either coming into the Zoom sessions, or when our students come back, that they are in those classrooms and they're giving a high quality feedback and timely feedback to those teachers, so that they can revise immediately and regroup and reteach to our students. And I think the last piece and very important component that we're really having conversations around is targeted and personalized interventions in place. And we have these in place now, but even more so. So looking at our Tier 1 supports that we're offering in class for every single learner. Looking at Tier 2 supports, so looking at pushing in to those classrooms. Michelle mentioned small groups, having that happen right now. We're doing that as well. But also, what else can we do? What other resources do we have where we could push in some support into the classroom to really intervene with those students? And we spoke about those neediest students, our special needs students, our EL students, and those student groups who are typically not performing at standard. And then also we're looking at our Tier 3 strategic intervention for our neediest students. So we're really looking at after school opportunities. We're having conversations about summer opportunities that we're going to have to engage in with our students. And then continued asynchronous opportunities for our students, and how do we continue to engage those students? So that's some of the things that we're doing in Othello.
Yeah, and thank you both for your leadership in your school districts, and continuing to provide those supports for those for all the students, but especially those most in need. So President Willis, at the higher education level, in the community college system, are you seeing similar, like what we read in the newspapers, that the pandemic is affecting students of color or students with disabilities more than others? And how is that impacting your work at Everett Community College?
Yeah, before the pandemic, we knew that we had students who had issues with access to Wi-Fi, the appropriate technology, food, childcare, a warm shelter over their heads. We knew that we had students that, had disabilities. We knew that we had students that if their, car broke down or they lost a tire, that would be the end of, their quarter effectively, because they now have to choose between paying for that vehicle to get their family to where they need to go versus having an education. Then when the pandemic hit, it just really exacerbated the problems that we already knew existed for our students of color and those in our underserved populations. And now that this is recorded, I guess I can't do the disclaimer that I usually say, is you'll never hear me say this in a recorded line, but COVID-19 in some respects was more of a blessing to some of our higher ed institutions, because things that we said we couldn't do before the pandemic, we've been able to do now. Things that I'll give you a quick example, some of our faculty would say, oh, I can't teach this science lab online. Well, it was more so about how they felt in wanting to do it versus the flexibility that we could now offer to our students. And so while they're dealing with some of these issues, we've had the CARES Act funds that have really helped, get technology that you've heard before, getting laptops in folks' hands, Wi-Fi, stocking up our food pantries and such. But it's also challenged us to be a bit more flexible in how we approach education. and the types of services that we give to our students. Because before, when you think about it in a face-to-face modality, we used to say that, students only learn 3 times a week for 50 minutes in each session. And they have to learn in XYZ chapter book, a textbook that's, 25 chapters, and you have to go through those 25 chapters in order to learn something. But what the pandemic is showing us is that we can be a bit more flexible while we know that our students are having these concerns. So one of the things that we're doing in Everett, along with what everyone else has said, is we are really challenging what the future will look like for our college. And I have challenged the institution to build a new strategic plan so we can reimagine the future. Does it mean that we need to reimagine what our curriculum looks like? How do we revise our syllabi to look out for the needs of our student parents, the students who are hungry, the students who don't have a place to stay, and those who need access to technology? Does it mean that we have to sit in a classroom to actually physically learn something, or can you do that with prior learning assessments? And how can we just be more flexible for our student population? Because one of the things that we know is that we're going to come out of this pandemic one day, but we have to be ready to get all those people who have lost their jobs and need opportunities for new careers. They don't have time to go through some of the traditional norms that we've set up to say that you have to have all of these classes just to get to this output. So our job at the community college, and especially at Everett, is to make sure that we're being flexible while attending to the needs of our student population, and knowing and being gracious, and knowing that if you're hungry, you're not going to be able to learn. I remember I used to, every morning I'll go, and while I'm reading the New York Times, I'll do a quick social media check. And there was always one little video that showed a professor, this was pre-pandemic, who was lecturing in the classroom holding the baby. And everybody fell all over it saying, oh my God, that's so great that the professor didn't A, kick the student out, but B, they're holding the kid while lecturing. Well, that's great, but there's a fundamental problem with the system. I'll go back to what Charlotte said before. So while we're praising that, why are we praising that? It's the system that has been messed up from the beginning. Because why can't we have opportunities for our student parents to have evening childcare? Most childcare places close at 6 o'clock, right? 5 or 6 o'clock, but yet evening classes start at 7 or 8 p.m. Then what do I do with my baby if I can't come to class? And then I'm penalized for not showing up. So we're looking at some of these issues. We are starting a weekend college at EVCC, really directed at our student parents. We're working with our local community partners, such as the YMCA, to come up with some of these evening childcare options that we need to have. And we're looking at how we can help our adult student population come back and get the credentials that they need. That shouldn't take them 5 years to do it, so they can go out and have healthy careers, so that some of these structural issues that we're seeing in society with not having enough food, not having Wi-Fi, not having technology, they can be able to provide those resources for their families.
Thank you. And I wholeheartedly agree with you about higher education being more flexible than we ever anticipated it could be. I wish I had a few more hours to talk to you about this weekend college idea. I think that's phenomenal. So Charlotte, in 2017, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences released its report on the future of undergraduate education. And in that report, PTech, which you direct, is highlighted as a promising practice in national priority number 2, which is to increase completion rates for high schoolers and reduce inequities that exist. Could you give us all a brief overview of PTech and how it's addressing the equity gaps in education?
Absolutely, thank you. I also just want to add one thing to that last conversation, Kate, if you don't mind, which is just Dr. Willis sparked something when talking about just sort of like what COVID has potentially accelerated. And I think that COVID also, on our side, on the industry side, really accelerated, inequity in basically the future of work, and this idea that this fourth industrial revolution is bringing so much automation It's automating, specific job roles out of our economy. We knew that was coming. We, the industries have been kind of preparing for this and how to upskill and reskill workers to stay, part of that economy. But, we're really at this kind of threat now where, we knew this was coming, but now it's been really pushed ahead. And so I think on my side, on the sort of pipeline creation side, and specifically diverse pipelines and equitable pipelines to the STEM field of work, it's been just really interesting how accelerated it's happened for us. But so PTech, yes, PTech stands for Pathways in Technology, Early College, High School. And as you said, Kate, I manage the global scale and replication of that model. We have a fantastic team at IBM who work on this initiative for us that was founded in 2011 in Crown Heights in Brooklyn. And the initiative itself, or the model, is actually a public-private partnership that combines public high school with community colleges and then industry partners. It's an extended high school, so students go to school for 6 years, but they're getting high school and college coursework at the same time. So as early as the summer after 9th grade, students are taking both college and high school courses towards an associate's degree in applied science, as well as that high school diploma. It's a free, no cost opportunity, meaning not only is the degree free, but the textbooks, the transportation, all operational costs. There's no cost to families. There's no application fee. And it's, an open enrollment model, meaning that anyone who's applying to a public education institution, a public high school in their district, can apply to this in whatever form exists within that district, whether it be lottery or kind of, indicating your top priority schools. There's no testing for admission or any barriers to entry, really. And so PTech combines these three sort of historically siloed institutions, right? I think we expect students, for some reason, to be able to move through high school, then to college and through college, and then once out of college to industry. And the reality is that there's a lot of holes in that pipeline, especially for students of color and especially for first generation students. So students who are in families and they're the first in their family to go to college. So PTech at its core is trying to make a more holistic system, I suppose, of these three institutions where students can move through at a pace that works for them. So some students graduate early and complete both that associate's degree and the high school diploma in 4 years. Some are in 5 years, some are in 6 years. And this model has really resonated with communities across the world. We're actually in 28 countries now and 11 states here in the US. We have over 240 schools and over 600 different industry partners. So although IBM founded this model in 2011, we really consider ourselves to be kind of like the stewards of it and make sure that it gets replicated with fidelity. But it's an open model for competitors in the industry, and also it's bipartisan. So, it's a model that I think has, like I said, resonated with so many communities, because not only is it ideally sort of like an innovative solution to public education and equitable education in STEM specifically, but it's also, on the workforce side in kind of a symbiotic way, ideally creating a more diverse pipeline to these tech companies that are supporting these PTech schools. And the important thing to note about sort of like the tech component or the industry component here is that we're not creating, Rashad Davis from Color of Change is one of my favorite sort of influencers in this space and leaders in this space. And he often talks about industries who provide charitable solutions for structural issues. And so rather than this being a charitable solution, we're not just giving grants or donations to schools or laptops, although those things are important. We're really becoming a full partner of this school model. And that means giving data for hiring and, future of work statistics, and really working backwards with the college to make sure that that associates in applied science is truly mapped to the skills that are going to be hireable and competitive in the next, 6 to 10 years. So it's really a full partnership. It's kind of a three-legged stool. And I think that that's like one of the major differentiators. To your point, Kate, about high school graduation and about equity, our PTech schools in the US serve 90% students who are either African American or Hispanic. It's absolutely meant for underrepresented communities, underserved communities, communities that serve students who probably wouldn't have an opportunity to have a paid internship at a company like IBM in their junior year of high school, which is a big part of this model. yeah, and I think that, you know, over the past almost 10 years that we're in now, we've obviously grown and scaled, but it takes a little while for us to have graduates because it's a 6-year model. And so we've really just started in the past few years having graduates, and we have 339 to date with the associate's degree and the high school diploma, and 40 of them have come to work at IBM, which we're pretty proud of. The rest of them are really actually going on to 4-year universities, which we did not expect as an outcome here. As many, as I said, are first generation. But these students have, you know, changed their own narrative and have decided that they want to go on to get more school. And we are absolutely thrilled with that outcome as well, and hope that they come back to our company, you know, when they're done with that part of their path.
That's outstanding results. So I'm going to jump ahead to a question and then come back to another one. But since we're talking about PTech, my understanding is that we're developing a proposal for a PTech type program with the Pasco School District. So I'm wondering if you would like to comment on that, and maybe Superintendent Whitney could talk about the impact that will have for her district.
Yeah, absolutely. And Superintendent Whitney, I'll let you chime in here on the more localized needs, but it's been a really fantastic partnership. We're working with Career Connect Washington. A lot of this work has been led by the Commission on Hispanic Affairs. And, you know, we've been working very closely. IBM doesn't have a strong foothold in the state of Washington. So, you know, we've been leading a lot of work, but really depending on our partners like Superintendent Whitney on the ground to give us a real understanding of the localized needs and how we can bring this model with fidelity, but also in a responsive way to the community in Washington and specifically in Pasco. So, you know, a lot of that work has consisted of filling out these applications for the Career Connect Washington grants, and we're in our second phase of those, and fingers crossed we'll have 2 to 3 schools in the state of Washington that are under the PTech umbrella moving forward.
So I just really want to acknowledge the Commission of Hispanic Affairs, Brian Moreno, and Dr. Rebecca Woods' support in this. We have a phenomenal partnership with CBC and WSU Tri-Cities as well. And we feel really blessed to work in a system where it's really kind of K-22, and we have these robust partnerships. And I feel really lucky to get to work with amazing leaders like Rebecca and Sandra. This PTech initiative, I think, is where all of the belief systems of our community are coming together in a really authentic way for our students. So one of the things that you think about when you think about educating youth is creating relevance for their coursework. And this PTech model, where they're engaging as early as 9th grade in coursework that really is a catalyst for the trajectory of their career. I mean, what a phenomenal way to create relevance for our students. And what we know about students who are first generation, whether it's first generation college, first generation into a professional career, is they need to be able to envision themselves, for example, on a college campus or in that career, either by seeing someone that looks like them in that career or having a mentor and a role model who's really inviting them into that career. And I feel like this PTech model really embraces all of that and sets our students up for this, just like I said, a trajectory of success. So it fundamentally aligns with Pasco School District's outrageous outcome of 100% of our kids graduating, but not only graduating with a career path and some steps taken to get there already. So it absolutely aligns with that. It aligns with our core values. And Charlotte talked so well about the barriers that it eliminates for our students who are coming to us as first generation or having other barriers to accessing college. So and then to be able to partner with the commission and our local higher ed agents or higher ed institutions, really it's like a dream. And it came together in this seamless way where you just know it's the right thing for our community. And there's been lots of staff, both in my system and the higher ed systems, in these industry partners with the commission that have really leaned into this and dug in a way that we're actualizing it. So as superintendents, we have a lot of conversations with partners. Rare is the conversation that ends up in action. And this is one of those where it was a robust conversation, and it's through the diligence of all of these leaders who truly embraced it to shepherd it through to where it is now. And especially given the complexity of this COVID environment, like there's still meetings happening. We're still moving it forward. So I just have such tremendous gratitude for the program, the people who are attached to it, and I am truly inspired to see the difference it will make for our students. It's programs like this that are going to absolutely be a game changer for our students, and I'm going to be excited to watch that magic happen and just have so much gratitude for everyone who's attached to it. So thank you.
Yeah. I think it was yesterday, I saw a report that just got released by the Washington State Achievement Council. It's equity report on post-secondary education. And really they were, the disparities that exist in high school educational outcomes, really leading to these equity gaps then in post-secondary enrollment. So it's phenomenal to think that we could have this program in one of our local districts soon. So I want to talk to Dr. Willis and Dr. Hurst about, you both addressed the need in the classroom to be, there's issues of implicit bias, there's issues of, just equity issues that exist, whether students are not, they're not coming to school, they don't have the technology, they don't have we're providing technology, but they may not necessarily be using it. So what are some of the ways that you are addressing, we're hearing a lot now about trauma-informed pedagogy, and I don't think COVID has all of a sudden made trauma an issue in pedagogy, right? We've always had students that are experience trauma. So is this something that you've always had in your institutions, like professional development for faculty around that area, or is it just kind of now being more enforced because of the pandemic?
So I think that we've always had it, but we have really stepped up our game in making sure that we provide more support now more than ever for our students. The old syllabi that had the sink or swim mentality, you know about those, Kate, where you have to do things at this date, at this time, and if you don't turn it in by 11:59 p.m., you've lost points. We've talked to, our faculty about that. We're also trying to break down the hierarchical nature of the classroom, where the professor is at the top and the students are at the bottom. And we're more trying to get professors to meet the students where they are. So it's more of a healthier environment for both student and professor. But I also want to take this question just a little bit further as I thought about it. We also need to look at trauma-informed work practices. Because although, we've been looking at this pre-COVID, there's something special about the year 2020 because we've had a pandemic with race relations for years in this country that have just really exacerbated during this time of the pandemic. And it was really brought to a head for me in one of our Black affinity groups at EVCC, where I went to the meeting and they were just really torn apart by having to watch, or seeing the video of George Floyd being murdered, or reading about the unfortunate passing of Breonna Taylor. And while I think of this, it's nothing new. But when I think about it, the late John Lewis said that Emmett Till was his George Floyd, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. But how does that affect our faculty and staff of color? And how does that affect then the students in the classroom? Because we expected as employers that our people would just get up and go to work and hop on Zoom as if nothing had happened. And that's a traumatic experience all in and of itself. So we're looking at some of those practices at EVCC. We're encouraging people to use EAP resources so that they can overcome, or to help them overcome some of these traumatic experiences. We've put in flexible schedules for our employees because one thing about Zoom, people expect you to log in at 11 o'clock, not 11:01, not 11:02. And then you can't go to the bathroom in between the meeting because your next one starts at 12 o'clock p.m. So we've had to look at the fact that, yeah, we're in this Zoom environment, but people still need those physical breaks in and out of that time. And so do our students. So, we've always had those practices of really, paying attention to your students and understanding that life happens to them, but we haven't been as good at looking at that from an employer or an employee standpoint. And that's something that we're working hard to achieve at the college.
Great. Thank you. Chris?
I will say that I certainly agree with Dr. Willis that I would say we have not always had this in place. I think it's been as recent as maybe 2 to 3 years ago. As I reflect back, I remember our board of directors actually wrote a policy that required our district to train staff to identify behaviors in individuals who may be experiencing trauma or in need of social emotional support. So I think that really happened about 3 years ago. But I think, as Dr. Willis has said, right now we're really hyper-focused on, as she said, meeting the students where they are right now. But what I will say, as a result of the policy being written and certainly the COVID pandemic, we certainly have been very hyper-focused, and we actually have instituted what we call a district wellness team that's allowed us to really focus on training, and not just for our staff, not just for our parents, but also for our students. And one of the things that we're very proud of is that we're training across the board for all of these individuals to recognize signs and symptoms of students who may be in distress, but also how do we handle those situations when our students are experiencing them. We also are proud of the work that we have done around creating guidelines, updating information on how to identify and respond to those students who may be exhibiting warning signs of either self-harm or suicide or depression, and really creating the system where we're reporting those types of abuses and having a threat assessment team, not just at the district level, but also at each school site to really identify and to respond to those crisis situations. I think one of the other pieces that I'll share that we're particularly proud of is the work that we've done around the Washington State Social Emotional Learning Standards. And what we've been able to do is take all of those standards, bring in a trainer, and really have that person train us, and then really implement down to the school, adult level, and student level. So we can really make sure that we're helping our students and we're really identifying and dealing with their social and emotional needs. So that's some of the work that we're doing here in Othello.
Great, thank you. I mean, all of these points that you're talking about today, I think we could delve into each one of them for several more hours. But unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. And so with the few minutes that we do have, I'd like to just ask each of you if there's an area that we haven't discussed today or one that we have, but you'd like to talk to just a few more details. We could each probably take a couple of minutes. So Charlotte, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think that, I mean, we've covered so much. Obviously, each of these topics, we could go much more in depth. I think just from my vantage point at the industry, the only other kind of thing that I think we're thinking a lot about, as I had mentioned earlier, about structures and systems in hiring and making a more equitable hiring system, is also kind of the tools that we use for hiring. And by tools, I mean resumes and interviews, things like, Zoom interviews, expecting that everyone has a place and Wi-Fi, bandwidth and tools necessary to do that. But also just things like resumes, which might seem really simplistic, but actually are the cause and basis for a lot of hiring bias because they often are a better representation of privilege and opportunity than they are a representation of skills. So, I think we're, on the industry side, trying to tackle some of these tools that are embedded in these systems and trying to find ways to make them more equitable.
Dr. Willis?
I just want to challenge, the audience to keep up the good work, but also look at, I know that this is a challenging time for us, but we also need to look at the opportunities presented by COVID to make our communities better, to make sure that we support our students in education, and how do we continue to innovate from this very challenging period in our time. Because although once this global pandemic ends, I know that something else will come up that we will have to face, but if we can all put our thoughts together and work for the greater good, we can do some really fantastic things for generations to come.
Yes, I recently heard a president of a four-year institution say, when this pandemic ends, it's not the new normal, it's the next normal, to get your point that something else will come along later. So innovation is key. Superintendent Whitney?
I just sometimes think that to highlight certain points, stories are a way to do that. And as we were talking about trauma-informed and education, I thought of an anecdote. So when I was a school counselor, I had two young boys who would not get off the bus until I went out and got them. I would go get them off the bus every day. I would take them and get them breakfast, take them to my office, hand them a little kit that had a toothbrush, baby wipes, hair gel, send them into the bathroom with a brand new pair of socks and a brand new pair of underclothes every day. That is the foundation of trauma-informed instruction. Those students, those young boys were not prepared to learn until they were clean, fed, and ready for the day. So when we talk about all these philosophies and throw out all these words, but when boots hit the ground, that's the kind of difference we're making with these philosophies. So I hold those young boys close because one day I went out to get them and they were just gone. And I still to this day don't know where they went, but that is the life of those of us who choose to be important to those students in our communities who need us the most. So I tell that story to illustrate what this all really means, but also as encouragement for those of us to do the work, to stay the course, to lean in during these hard times, and really to echo what Dr. Willis said, that this is really the responsibility of our whole community, and I'm honored to do my part.
Thank you. So Dr. Hurst, final words?
Yes, I'd just like to share an appreciation for sponsoring the session. I think the topic of educational equity and racial justice is extremely important. And I wholeheartedly agree with what's been shared about this as a community approach. And one of the things I'll share is I think it really starts at the top as well, especially in the districts, higher ed, with our boards developing policy around educational equity. I think it's important that we all develop a common understanding around the language that we're using. Like when we say educational equity, what does that mean? Cultural responsiveness, inclusion, implicit bias, what does all that mean? Developing a common understanding. I think it's extremely important also for communities to identify the top equity issues within the schools, but also within the community. I think it's also important, I think I would challenge the communities as well and the audience to define equity core values. How do you interact with one another? How you speak? How do you behave with one another? And then I think also that there needs to be a call to action for communities where we're looking at community-based equity audits and then moving forward together and planning together.
Great. Well, thank you all for giving us your time today. This was a wonderful conversation and I would love to continue it. But we have another session coming up in just a few more minutes. So I want to wish you all success as you strive to make a positive difference in the lives of all the students that you work with. And thank you.
Kate, thank you so much for moderating this fantastic discussion. If we were in person, we'd all be giving you all a really big round of applause. I want to thank Michelle, Dr. Willis, Dr. Hurst, and Charlotte also for sharing your experiences and your expertise. We really appreciate your contribution to the conversation. And I just have to say, I've listened intently in this session, and I'm really, truly inspired by it, by all of you. And we're very lucky to have the leaders that we have in education. So thank you so much. If you're joining us for the next session, which begins at 11:15, you can participate by using the same Zoom link. In this listening session, panelists will discuss pathways for all residents to have equal access to economic opportunity. And as a reminder, all the sessions from the Diversity Summit will be posted on the Chamber's YouTube channel and at tricityregionalchamber.com. Thank you so much for joining us.